Good evening and welcome to this evening's final event, a discussion panel with the lecturer that just before presented, archaeogeneticist from the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig and the Masaryk University in Brno, Professor Zuzana Hofmanova, and archaeologist from the University of Warsaw, Professor Małgorzata Kot. Welcome our guests. And my name is Łukasz Lamża. I'm going to be the host this evening from the Copernicus Center at the Jagiellonian University. And I think, and of course, if anyone has the questions, I think, I will come back to you, but I will first use the privilege of the host and begin myself. And as I was listening to your talk and when I was reading your papers, I'm always thinking the same thing. How brave intellectually do we have to be and how cautious do we have to be when interpreting, for example, genetic signals? And, treat this as an open question to both of you. For instance, you showed us the genetic relationships between people, and you used words such as marriage and partner, right? But we're essentially talking about people that came from East Asia. You yourself told us that we don't really have any written accounts written by those people. And all we know really is that two people had a kid. This is all we know. They exchanged genes. So when you're reading this sort of data, and it also involves just plain old archaeological data, I mean, how much can we assume? How open minds do we need to have? Or is it just sorted out?
So, if I may, thank you for your question. I think it's an extremely important question. It's something where it really helps to discuss between different disciplines, with historians, with archaeologists, etc. Because as biologists, we can't reach that conclusion at all. Yes, indeed, we observe a reproductive union. We observe two people, and we kind of can connect them only when we actually find their child. So there might have been also marriages where we did, or reproductive unions, where we did not kind of find that out. But it's like certain things are kind of we see in our data again and again and again. So for example, this idea of the female exogamy, that's something that's practiced so universally at these communities that we no longer kind of speak about that this was just a random happening and reproductive union that just happened to happen. But actually as something that these societies practice actively and kind of pursued. That's also kind of connected to these levirate unions. Like it's not like one-time event where we would see it once, but it's something that we see repetitively again and again. So, and at some point, especially when you are trying to connect to historical records where they do not or very rarely mention reproductive unions. There they only mention marriages. So when we make that transition of trying to interpret these lines of evidence together, that's where we, for kind of ability to communicate, actually often borrow language from the other discipline.
Okay. Sometimes. Would you like to comment on this issue?
Just maybe to add that this question is very right, because one thing we need to understand is always we come from our cultural background. So we try to, we see the world through our cultural background. So we assume from the beginning, okay, this is the marriage, because this is how we live here. But on the other hand, you can analyze these graphs and see, for example, if someone has 7 kids with the same parents, it means this relation is long-lasting relation. Even though it might be not a marriage, it means this is like lifelong relation. If this community would have just single children by each couple, that would mean something else. So, we can see something from this data, but you are right that we are absolutely biased, and sometimes we don't think of our bias we have. So this is crucial. And another thing is, it's also the brave thing is to say something, but also very brave sometimes for the scientist is to say, I don't know. And maybe it's even more difficult sometimes.
Yeah, because persistent genetic relationship does not have to mean a, you know, formally recognized relationship. It could be an affair that takes a long time, right? For instance, I mean, are these hypotheses even taken into account, that these people didn't have marriages at all? They were just having affairs that lasted a long time. Or, I mean, in the Lebersdorf cemetery, I mentioned to you before we had the lecture, there was this very peculiar case of a man having children with his own grandson's partner, right? And the thought that immediately came to my mind, was it an actual relationship, or was it, I don't know, a sexual assault, for example, which is on the table, right? So I was just wondering, is there any methodology to think about these things, or do you just look for repeating patterns?
So here, I guess the answer would be for these girls. So the girls always come from outside. And this cannot be the affair. They come from particular places, always outside the community. It means this is the arrangement. It's kind of, you know, social agreement that I do take a partner from which comes from another genetic community. It's culturally, of course, restricted, but like this why, what's the background within it? There must be always either the patrilinear or matrilinear, it doesn't matter, but it's always in the culture, because we try to prevent from interbreeding too much between each other. So yeah, this is the answer.
Yeah, and yeah, very much so. And and these repeating patterns are important, because you would see it only once in this case of this levirate union. That's would be a kind of conclusion we could also kind of reach. But if you have that case in every pedigree several times over, and every single pedigree you look, it's like kind of stops to be something unusual, but it starts to be kind of really something that's happening. And that was, I think, kind of the interesting thing, that when we went to the historical records, or our co-authors went to the historical records and found that in the steppe societies, this indeed was extremely important, and that the widows actually had like that was a point in life where they had agency, at least to a degree, and where the kind of this marriage with the widow actually really meant that you were kind of stabilized, like kind of making your position in the society more stabilized, and kind of that if, for example, it was a widow of a ruler, then if you wanted to be a ruler, like marrying that widow would be actually an extremely important step in that way. Yeah, so yeah, the connection is definitely there, but in general, like, we don't know what the people thought about this, and it's not only the women. It's I try to avoid the language of like that the men were taking the women from the other sides. I was trying to say communities were kind of getting these reproductive partners, because it's not assumed that the men would kind of had much kind of say in that, because we also find fathers that were 14 years old in that case. So it was really kind of a arrangement, or we think it was an arrangement between different communities, likely between different patrilines, and that it really kind of meant also political connection to a degree. But
go on.
One more thing is that we do not know who was not buried at these cemeteries. So
Excuse me, could
we
you
do
repeat?
not know who was not buried at the cemeteries.
Not buried. Yeah.
So we do not know. Maybe they had other women and other children, and they are just not there. And then we can't say anything about that.
So what are the possibilities? I mean, let's open our minds. Let's say that there were a lot of more women in the society, but they were not buried. Why?
Because they went to another community. They were married
Okay.
to the men in another community. So if we would study more of these cemeteries around, we would start finding these women around somewhere.
So women came, had children with the local men, I guess raised the children at least a little bit, and then left to a different community?
No, it's like if the girl is born, so you have a daughter, this daughter will be married to
the
a
mother
man.
stays, but the daughter leaves.
Yes.
Fair enough. All right. How confident are you in the use of the word marriage?
To a degree, yeah. So it's I would not say that all these reproductive unions were marriages, but I think we see marriage patterns and we can speak about marriage networks because it's kind of something that's happening kind of, let's say, on systematic level or kind of in that way.
I'm just wondering, am I being nitpicky? I mean, am I going too deep? I don't know, is it rude what I'm saying? But I'm just wondering, marriage is a ceremony. It starts with a ceremony. There has to be someone officiating the ceremony. It's in front of the people. There are certain rules to a marriage, as we know it, right? And, you know, ceremonies don't fossilize. They don't leave genetic data. I mean, did Avars have marriages?
So they like very little is known. There are actually like 3 mention of anything related to women in the about all history of Avars, and these are very like far-reaching mentions. And I think I will be brave here and say I don't know. So.
Yeah, I come from Stone Age archaeology, so, you know, if your question relates to me, the question would be, did Neanderthals marry? I don't know.
Okay, all right. So, okay, I'm going to continue being the bad cop, just because it's more fun. You asked the question, were they the real Avars, right? It just stuck with me. Okay, were the Avars at all? I mean, did they use the word Avar? They probably did it, right?
So we don't know what language they spoke.
Yeah.
We know so little about them, and I think that's kind of great that we can say at least something. But that's the word Avar is something that has been mentioned in the sources, and the name itself, and that's what I was trying to point out, has certain power for these societies. Because the word Avar is connected to this Ruran empire that had kind of ruled the steppe for so long. So by claiming the connection to a name, you are also claiming the descendants and kind of your importance at the steppe. So they might have for these reasons, at least to the outsiders.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the crucial question which you ask is this question about the identity. Because what we are here having is like one village. Because 140 people for 6 generations makes like 30 people per generation. This is a kind of, 2-3 families. So you have a village of people who like behave in a certain way, but also genetically are very far from what is in the surroundings. So they look Asian, they are genetically Asian. And they live there and they come from this Asia, far Asia, with their culture. And what happens is like they something happens that the local community which lives nearby, even though they don't interbreed, takes the culture. So takes all these elements of the culture of the Avars. They live in the Avar way, let's say. So they wear the same like suits, they wear the same clothes, the same ornaments, and so on. They live in a similar way, but on the same way, the same time. So they need to communicate. Yeah, they trade between each other, but they don't interbreed. And for me, this is like super interesting to ask the question, which probably we'll never know, if these local people, after this 5-6 generation, do they feel Avar? Then do they see that they like behave the same way as these people who looks differently still? Like are differently. They can see like why they don't marry each other, because they can see that this girl is not from our community. She looks differently. Yeah, like it's clear. So like this question of the identity is crucial, and for me very important, because we never ask this question for the Stone Age. We never think like, did Neanderthals have this identity of Neanderthals? If I find half Neanderthal, half Denisovan girl, did she feel Neanderthal or Denisovan? Yeah, what was her identity? In the Stone Age, we never asked this question. So here, the first time, because of the genetic analysis, we are able to start asking these questions. So, like, because we combine archaeology, we combine written sources, history, and genetics. So for the first time, we are able to start asking this. And later, probably, we will go further in time and start asking it also for the Stone Age. So that's like super inspiring.
Yeah, but I was wondering, because you have to assume that somebody belonged to a certain culture, and I noticed that in the literature there's this custom of using these names, like this is the Mierzanowice culture, this is the Unetice culture, this is something Prague cultural something. But does anyone really belong to a culture? I mean, do we belong to a certain culture, right? Because based on my clothes, I'm, probably Chinese, right? If you decide to be buried with your papers, the archaeologists will find you members of the Germanic culture, because all the papers are in English, of course, right? I want to be burned after my death, so I'm a member of the Iranian culture or group, probably, because they invented immolation, right? So, I mean, I'm just wondering, is it obvious in the field of archaeology and history that people actually did belong to certain cultures? Is there an opinion that you can't actually say that individuals belonged to certain cultures? This is like a approximation that we used to communicate more easily.
So I kind of leave the prehistoric part, but for the historical periods, and for prehistory as well, it is a debate. It's definitely a debate. There is no debate about it if it's a debate. But for at least for the periods where we have historical records, we know that at least from the point of view of those people writing them, they in certain regions and certain periods saw these peoples. How those peoples felt about themselves is also a question, where, if the Byzantine author is writing about the Avars or the Slavs, did they feel like that it was so unified, or did actually, was their identity actually much more fractioned? And, but if there is kind of, let's say, some albeit vague kind of connection between the historical records and the archaeology, you can at least start thinking about this. I mean, you can't be really sure, but maybe for prehistory, I think it's even more difficult in that sense.
Yes, especially that there is no written sources. So what we base on is only material culture. And within the material culture, we can always understand that there is this part of like the daily life material culture, which has these useful features, which needs to be there. So for many of these artifacts, it doesn't matter from it doesn't belong to Chinese or like European culture. It's just it's a glass, and it must be like useful tool for drinking, and that's it. So like it's on. So on one part, and we don't understand, or we don't fully know what is the useful part, which is and the further we go in the history, the less we understand. So, and then on the top of that, we have this cultural background. So something what comes with this like tradition. Okay, we usually do it this way. If I make a pot, I do it this way. And in this village, they do it another way. And this, like, even though this is the same pot for drinking or for putting, cooking. Yeah. So like, the further we go in the history, the less we understand where is this boundary between the usefulness of a tool or the piece which we see and this up level of the cultural level, that's traditional level. So this question is probably like, we will never understand, because what we do in archaeology, we find it, we try to, distinguish, okay, this is different from this. They do it different, slightly different, this pottery. But was it a way of, doing it just because this was more useful, or they just change it because this guy was a genius and he invented something, or was it like the cultural shift? So probably we will never go further, deeper into this question.
Maybe there's someone in the audience who wishes to ask a question. I see raised hands. Do we have some additional microphones for walking purposes, or should I just go on? I think I'll do it. All right. Here you go.
Hi, thanks so much for the amazing lecture. And I have a question which is maybe to a degree misguided, because I don't fully understand the methods you are using. But from the lecture, I could understand that the DNA traces that you find are very fragmented, incomplete, and so on. So it's kind of like putting together a sort of like jigsaw puzzle with lots of missing elements. And then at some point you are kind of trying to my understanding, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, you're trying to like fit a model which is a fair account on this data. And my question is like, having this incomplete information here and there, how many, let's say, sufficiently plausible and sufficiently well-fitting models or possible scenarios you can fit to such data, if that question makes sense?
So
Thanks.
Thank you for the question, and it's a very valid question. So it very much depends on type of analysis we are doing or on what we are asking. So I will start with the easiest, so the relatedness. So like to tell if somebody is mother and somebody is a child is not a difficult thing to do genetically. So like the number of kind of positions, the amount of DNA you need to have is not that much, because it's like they should have like half the same. So it's quite easy in that regard. Now, when you are speaking about kind of the resolution, and the more kind of into more resolution you go, so kind of tell the difference between, let's say, Asian and European ancestry is easier than tell differences within Europe. Yeah, so there you always need kind of more positions and be more careful about your data. So we use kind of a battery of methods for this kind of analysis, and many of these methods have like confidence intervals that tell us how sure we are. Yeah, so in this way, kind of the results that I showed you, I'm quite confident about them in that sense. So it's not actually so bad. Like the DNA is damaged, but we still have for most of the individuals at least 1 million positions that are covered, and that's so 1 million data points to compare with, and that's quite a lot to do these kind of things on those resolutions I was showing you.
Okay.
Muszę to zrobić po polsku, bo będzie mi tak dużo łatwiej. Super. Mówiła Pani o tym, że w tych stanowiskach archeologicznych odkrywano paski, czy też części ubrań, które były do siebie podobne. A czy jakiekolwiek elementy, które świadczyły o wierzeniach religijnych, też na tych stanowiskach się znajdowały? Cały problem w tym, że być może dla naszej kultury ta strefa religijna, strefa przynależności do pewnych wierzeń już jest taka bardziej rozmyta, natomiast im bardziej cofamy się do tyłu, tym mentalność ludzi, czy kultura ludzi, czy ich wierzenia odgrywały dla nich kosmiczną, kolosalną rolę. Być może dlatego, to jest oczywiście przypuszczenie, te dwie kultury tak blisko ze sobą kilometrami związane nigdy się nie połączyły.
So the question is that in the cemetery, you mentioned certain artifacts found. I think there was these belt endings, these things, and the question was, were there any artifacts that had clearly religious imagery? And sort of the deeper assumption of the question is that as you go deeper and deeper in time, people would find religion more and more important to their lives. So can you find something like this in the archaeological record? And I think I will address the question to both of you, because I think it's an interesting one. And I found this assumption especially interesting. Is it true that as you go back in time, you find unmistakable artifacts of religious nature?
So like if there are artifacts, so there are not clear artifacts that we can connect in that way. However, like on these strapped ends, there are sometimes forms that have been sometimes connected to, let's say, Scandinavian imaginary that's connected to ritual and or religious belief. So there is something, because sometimes these symbols can get transmitted through very in complex way. So we do not know how much that was important for the people in that sense, but there is some people do find these connections. And as to if, like, for example, these two sides have differed in that respect, we can't really say. It's not at the moment. It's at least from in our understanding. That's not something that we can gather from the grave goods at this point of time.
Yeah, we know very little about their religion, to be honest. Well, I would say even nothing. And yeah, the further we go in the history, the less we know. So actually, for most of the cultures which we study, the only, let's say, religious element which we assume is religious is the burial. So we assume this is some kind of the ceremony. So assuming on how they bury their dead. So is it, for example, inhumation? So they put just the body, or did they burn their dead? So based on this, we try to like differentiate and say something about this. I wouldn't even say beliefs, but like their ceremonial or not utilitarian way of living. But from like the majority of the archaeology, we just even don't discuss the religion as what exactly did they believe in.
If I have one more addition to this, and that is that that comes with the cremations and inhumations in then kind of periods that are more related to Slavic speakers. So it is thought that the inhumations are appearing together with Christianization. So you can track Christianization of regions by seeing where inhumations are appearing and where cremations are disappearing.
This is also, maybe just to explain more, one of the reasons why we didn't or were not able to do this results or analysis before. Because actually, if you see through the whole prehistory of Poland, let's focus on Poland now. So at the time of Stone Age, let's say, the people buried their dead just as a burial, as a dead person underground. But that's starting from the Bronze Age. They start burning their dead, and it lasts until Slavs. So for this like very long period of more than 2,000 years, you have a gap, because when you have just a burned dead like human remains, there is no DNA preserved. So we know very few about and very little about the DNA of people in Poland between the Bronze Age up to the Slavs are coming, because at the moment the Slavs comes, they start first also burning, but then later they go to the inhumation. So this makes our analysis much more complicated. And for these reasons, for example, when we contributed with our Roman period, so the 1st century human remains to the paper, but actually we found them in caves. And you know, I found some human individuals in the cave. I dated it. Okay, this is 3rd or 4th century, but I know that these people should be buried not here in the cave, because this is not how they should be buried. They should be burned and buried in their cemetery, which means that this is not actually normal individual from this point of view, like cultural. So of course we did the analysis, genetic analysis, we compared, we contributed to paper, but we also know that our individuals which we contributed are kind of extraordinary. So this makes all our analysis which we do on genetics, especially in Poland, absolutely complicated and difficult.
Yeah, thank you. And just a brief thing that came up to my mind is that whenever you have an individual, like one case of anything, I think it's always risky. I mean, science likes big numbers and science is based on big numbers. So when you study 1,000 burials, then you can start making wise assumptions. But when you have one, it's always tricky because this could have been a freak accident, right? All right. I have no idea who was, you're going to handle the, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great talk, by the way. And I wanted to ask about slavery. There is a patriarchality you found, which is quite clear and quite obvious in many societies, and it is accompanied with female exogamy, which is okay. But the question is whether in some cases there is no situations of slavery, of kidnapping, and whether you can check it looking at the genetic distance. For example, if there is an agreement between two close communities, so to say, or societies, that's okay. And in that case, there should be not a big genetic distance between the female and all the guys, for example, from the community where she came to. But if this distance is a bit bigger, it might be related with kidnapping or slavery, and maybe in that case, their bodies after they dead could be deposited in some other ways or left just for carnivores or whatever, So anyway, if there are any cases of slavery, and whether you can find such cases in this material.
So in this material, not really, because I mean, if they were not buried, that we don't have them. But we have specifically kind of looked into that question in a sense that we looked at the individuals that are unrelated to anybody at the cemeteries, because that would kind of be the idea that if in the unrelated portion of the cemetery you would have different ancestries than in the related one, that maybe those individuals are, as you suggest, kind of maybe not there exactly of their own will, or like something different has been happening. And what we have found is that these unrelated individuals are actually having very much the same ancestry as the rest of the communities, and in large majority are women of reproductive age. So our interpretation is that these were actually partners of the patriline males from the site, but we just can't link them to anybody because we didn't find their children. So maybe their children left or were buried elsewhere, or maybe they didn't have any. And at that point, the woman is like just unrelated and unconnectable with just barely genetic methods to the rest. Yeah. So, but slavery is a very interesting question. Yeah, I hope we will have more studies on that in future.
Fertility was also about 20-25%. Would you like to comment?
No, I think.
Okay. Just one note. I'm sorry I'm interjecting, but it's very difficult to prove slavery. And I think like 2 or 3 months ago, there was this paper published in Antiquity that they were very proud of proving actual case of slavery in Egypt. And they did it by finding shackles, actual shackles that you would put on people's legs. And they found imagery of the exact same model of shackles, so to speak, on a human being, which proved that it wasn't used on an animal, on a human being, and it was like a bullseye. But other than that, actually finding the actual machinery of slavery, I think it's actually very difficult to prove, even if we have examples of massive labor I have seen this discussion in this paper that they may have been paid. We don't know this. I mean, they may have been there of their own will, even if they came from a different part of the continent. So it's very difficult. And I just remember this excitement that was visible in the paper, that they have the shackles, they have the imagery of the shackles. And I think they even found some mentioning of how much it was difficult to capture these people. So, but other than that, I don't think it's that easy to say, yeah, he was a slave, right?
Not at all. And even like shackles is something that has been used to trace slavery throughout Europe, but it was also shown that in some cases, at least in Europe, I don't want to kind of question that particular case. It has been used not for cases of slavery, but as a punishment. So you can be actually using shackles in various ways, and so that's another difficulty. Not to mention that slavery is not necessarily a lifelong situation. Things can change. So it's a very complex question, but I think there will be some ways in the future how to look into that.
So if I would just intellectual game, how would we imagine these people to be in the graveyard? So I assume even if they were put on the same graveyard, maybe apart, so this would have to be adult individuals, maybe adult and children, but like also adult individuals, which probably should have some different isotopic signals. So their diet should be different, with less protein than the general community. And then they should also have this strontium signal saying that they come from somewhere else. And also maybe by anthropological analysis, we would say, okay, maybe they died because of some more diseases, and so they were not treated the same as the other part of the community. And then maybe if we have this graveyard and with huge amount, like let's say in these 400 people, 100 would look like that, we could assume. And then we would have this hypothesis in nature saying that, yeah. But this is like just a way of imagining how we would need to, like, what kind of proofs we would need to have altogether to say at the end, maybe. Yeah.
Maybe signs of very hard physical labor. It can leave traces in the bones, like lifelong hard physical labor, injuries. I don't know. I'm just riffing here.
It could, but it also, like, for example, if you would think about Islamic world, like the slaves were often not actually doing such a hard labor. They were serving in palaces, etc. So it's not as easy. But it's a possibility definitely with isotopes, or also with ancestry. If you assume a slave trade that would be long distance, then kind of people coming from elsewhere also genetically would be a kind of good indication. And but what's interesting is that in case it's actually possible in some cases to see castration on skeletal remains, and that's
Really?
yes, like testosterone deficiency over a long time. So it's of course interpretation, but in connection with the context and many other things, you could start to reach these conclusions.
But you would need soft tissues, right, to find these.
You long-term lack of testosterone leads kind of signs on your bones as well.
Through lowered levels of testosterone.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay. Questions?
This is related to the first question somewhat, but just curious about how the phenomenon of petrifaction, or the bone becoming petrified, how that would affect your work, or how far back you can get samples in terms of time.
So I think I was kind of mentioning that the oldest DNA has been extracted for like 1 million year old, or in the case of sedimentary DNA, 2 million year old, but in case of bone, like 1 million year old mammoths. But that is from the Arctic, where the conditions are very, very different. Where exactly this doesn't happen. So it's very much dependent on the actual conditions. Many of the finds are kind of discovered in caves, because of the conditions, etc. And one hope is that maybe we also can eventually get better methods and recovering the DNA than we have at the moment. But I kind of, as an expert on the prehistory, I let you answer further.
Yeah, so from archaeological perspective, the conditions are crucial. Two conditions, one is moisture, one is temperature. So the colder, the better. The worst possible is the mixture of warm and humid. So if you have warm and humid conditions, the bones basically dissolve and there is no DNA preserved. And for this reason, we have very few paleogenetic data from Southeast Asia. And the more to the north, the better it comes. Europe is quite good. The caves are the best. Here, the permafrost is the best, of course. And this is why I'm working in caves, and also when I work, because I work in Central Asia, I work in the mountains, so in the cold conditions. But even in these mountains, when we find the burials which are in the open-air sites, I have Bronze Age burials, and there is just, from the whole burial of 3 individuals, I have 2 teeth left. It means like for the last 3,000 years, all the bones disappeared. So if there is no bones, you can imagine there is also no DNA. So like the conditions are crucial here, and we are seeking for the sites, particular sites with very good preservation of bones, and in these bones, the very good preservation of organic, like the genetic material and also proteins. So we are very picky here from the matter of paleogenetics, yeah.
So maybe like for future, I think the hope is also in the sedimentary DNA, where like it starts to be kind of possible to get DNA from the soil. Also, in case you get layers that are relatively stable, and if you try hard enough and invest enough resources into it, you actually can get, in some cases, DNA from this soil. And as the methods get better and better, and the hope is that maybe we can get kind of better in that regard. I mean, it was possible to get a DNA from a pendant that was from Paleolithic layers. So who knows?
I tell a story about the pendant because it's super cool. You know, our problem always is that even if I find human remains in the layer, especially in the cave, and I find some artifacts, I cannot be sure that this guy actually used these artifacts, because this might be, 2 different episodes. They are just in one layer, but it doesn't say anything. So for many years, up to 2023, probably, we could never say, okay, this guy actually used this artifact. And the first, was this paper published, it was from Denisova cave. They found this pendant made of deer tooth. And they actually analyzed human DNA, which was preserved on this deer pendant. So someone was wearing, and because of wearing it, the guy was sweating, or the guy or the girl was sweating, and because of sweating, the DNA came to the pendant. So they could actually say, okay, this pendant was used by Homo sapiens, so in that case, modern human. They really wanted to prove it that this was Denisovan, I guess. But unfortunately, the answer was this pendant was used by modern humans. But for the first time, we could actually connect human individual, or actually in this case the species, to the artifacts. But this is very, very rare. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Questions? I see hands.
Is it working? Okay. I have a technical question, if I may. I noticed that you are using PCA a lot. And to my mind, of course, I might be wrong, but to my mind, it's rather a simplistic way of dimensionality reduction. And I wanted to ask you whether you have ever tried or considered to try some other methods like TreeMap, UMap, Disney, or PackMap? And if you did, how would it affect your research and your analysis?
So indeed, it's very crude, but if we can show it on this crude method, then we are kind of more sure about it than otherwise. We did try as a field, and also in our department, in my lab, some of these methods. The problem is with the interpretability of the distance in particular. So if on a PCA, if I have two individuals, and they are mother and a child, mother and a father, the child will be in between and kind of equally distant to each other. And it's not the case in many of these methods. And so it makes it really hard to understand kind of the population relationships of the patterns that we are seeing and interpreting them. That's one way. And another way is that, and that's kind of related to, I think, one of the first questions that were posed, is about the quality of the data. And in many of these PCAs, we use modern data and we project our ancient DNA data onto it. And the reason for that is that we have relatively a lot of genetic information, but still quite, only quite some fraction of the human genome. And if we would compare one sample, another sample, the intersection would be very small. So comparing it to a larger, much more complete data set gives us this possibility of projecting, which again is not completely simple in many of these methods.
Yes, any other questions? Yes.
So I was wondering if there is any chance that you will probably maybe through a contact with someone who is doing research in Asia, be able to locate the origins of Avars in Asia and therefore find out something more about them this way.
Okay. So if we would like to, for example, connect them to the Roman Empire, there's very little amount of graves that are actually kind of assignable to this period. It is thought that these kind of communities were mobile. It's not easy to find their graves. It's not that we would have these large cemeteries that would be easily identifiable. So maybe we will be lucky and we can find somebody who would kind of be related, but so far it hasn't happened for the Avars. What we did know is that we have a study about Huns. And there we did find kind of this long-distance relatedness from Asia to the Carpathian Basin. For very few individuals, we don't see this kind of a large influx of kind of Asian ancestry as we see in the Avar period. But for the Huns, we see this kind of network. So it is possible. It's just we don't have the right graves yet.
Can I have my own question? I just followed it up because at the beginning of your lecture you told about getting all the different sciences together and how good it is. But so far we spoke quite a lot about genetics and archaeogenetics, a little bit about sort of classical archaeology of objects. I was wondering if we could go back to this first claim that it's so great to get all these sciences together. I mean, is it? So, to be more specific, there is a lot of sciences that could have something to say about how people lived 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. I don't know, ethnography, economy, sociology, psychology, and you probably encountered in your professional lives people representing all those disciplines. So which of them are surprisingly useful and which of them are surprisingly useless?
It's really hard to say who would be useless.
I know it's a problematic question because some of these people can be sitting in the room or listening to you, but I mean there definitely have to be like hits. Like you met someone from a different discipline and you said, "Wow, you can actually help me, not just talk, but actually help me." Could you give an example of something like
Philosophy.
this? Excuse me?
Philosophy.
Philosophy.
The first one.
Yeah, team philosophy. How can it help?
By asking general questions. Like on the type, we sometimes dig too much.
All right.
You know, like we stick to the details too much, and sometimes we need someone coming from outside and showing us how much we are biased.
All right.
So this is something. So this, like, yeah, something in between psychology and philosophy, I would say.
So I'm sorry, just very briefly, just put those philosophers in your papers as co-authors because they need it. They definitely need it a lot. So just remember, if they helped you, put them in because they don't publish as much as you do. Okay, sorry, continue.
The next one, surprising, mathematicians.
As the
Even
very
not
useful.
statistics, because statistics, like genetics, half of genetics recently is statistics actually, but the pure mathematics, like, I mean, modeling and thinking from the point of view of how to model the data, this become, because we are more and more struggling with this big data bases, and this is something we need to start coping with more and more in archaeology also, not only in genetics. And it's not always statistic which helps us, but also like really the modeling. So there, from this surprising ones, because, you know, the one which is not maybe surprising is paleobotanics. Yeah, or, you know, like the colleague which sits next to me in my institute is the guy who is specialist in the small mammals. So he's studying mouses and rodents. And, you know, like we are collaborating very much because he tells me by this little rodents which I find in caves what was the climate at the time, because these mouses, they don't migrate much, so we can actually see what was the surrounding, how much water there was, how much wood there was, and so on, by small mammals. But, you know, mouses, yeah, so like with lots of this paleobiology disciplines, but also, you know, physics. Like we do the datings, and these datings recently, this is like really deep physics in it, like the optical stimulation luminescence, you know, like I can say the name, but like I have the guy in the Polytechnic University who is doing the analysis, and this is like pure physics. The radiocarbon dating is also the same. So like we are seeking different methods of squeezing, you know, this data which we have, because like again, the further we go in time, the less data we have. So like in my time period, we are really like now analyzing piece by piece every like sediment piece we have. We are sieving the whole sediment we are digging through a sieve of mesh 0.3 millimeters. And then, you know, searching through them if we can pick any charcoals, any piece of bones, anything, and analyzing, and even trying now to trace DNA within the sediments, so or the lipids within the sediments, or any traces of combustion, even if there is no charcoals. So, you know, this geochemistry, which is very now deep going to archaeology, yeah. Like interdisciplinary is even, like I would say multidisciplinary is more like what we are doing. Archaeology is just this very little part. At the beginning to dig, and at the end to try to like see the whole picture. That's my role.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to this wonderful list. I just would like to return to kind of like one thing that you kind of ask as a part of your question, that the other disciplines did not contribute to that research. And I would actually very much like argue against that, because, you know, like if I want to mention that something is of our period, this is based on, you know, decades of like so much research that went to it so that I could make that statement. And for me to like to be able to kind of say who is and who is not culturally similar to somebody else, again, this is like a work of many people. If when I say that these individuals had no like difference in occupation or kind of skeletal markers, again, this is a lot of work. So, you know, like I kind of simplify these claims, not to mention history that asked the question in the first place. So it's of course I'm geneticist, so I do kind of emphasize the role of genetics, and genetic data is the, let's say, newest person on the block in that way, in those debates. But there's much to build on, and I don't think we would be. I would be having these kind of papers and kind of have those conversations without those other fields. They're completely essential.
Okay. A short story. I read a paper about a study of a Swiss population. It was 500 years ago, something like this. They found human remains in a cemetery in Switzerland. And one of the persons looking at the remains was a physiotherapist. And he said, oh, this guy was a tailor, probably, or did something manually like being a tailor for all his life, because he recognized the specific way the hands were, malformed after 50 years of this tedious work. And they got the idea of comparing the remains of those people with contemporary remains of people whose jobs we know. And they kind of opened up a new method of analyzing human remains, and they actually produced these measures that they could do this quantitatively. And they put out a paper predicting the jobs of people from 500 years ago by basically hands. They mostly used hands. So, but it was an accident that there was a physiotherapist in the room and just noticed something. I don't know how robust the results are. Yes, we still have time for one question.
I have one more about the positive controls. So at some point I read the paper when they asked me for providing for some work like positive controls, and they gave an example of the Galileo space probe, which had some equipment to detect life on other planets. And what they did while sending it to the mission, they used one of the paths next to Earth and set the instruments to observe Earth, to be able to check whether they are able to detect the life or signatures of life where they know that the life apparently is there, right? And I was just wondering whether for this genetics archaeology, this intersection of genetics and archaeology, whether there are some cases of this positive controls, in a sense that we, for instance, know specific community from, I don't know, let's say 18th century, which is very well documented in terms of, I don't know, birth certificates and so on, so that we know who was connected to whom and so on and so forth. And whether using the methods, like pretending that we know nothing and we just start getting the samples and so on, whether we can recreate it, and what would be the accuracy of such an exercise, if there are any.
So I don't know of any study that would be doing this on a large scale. There were small scale investigations of that type when let's say known relationships have been confirmed, and they're confirmed. So that's kind of so it might be very interesting. There are these cases where, as you say, we know, but it's also a little bit expensive exercise to investigate this. And if you already know the relationships, it's a little bit hard to justify. Not to mention that you are kind of destructing human remains of very recent populations. So those people often have still living relatives. So this research would very likely need consent of also modern day people still living, etc. So it's not impossible. It would be kind of fun, but it's not so easy to set up.
Okay, thank you. Oh no, I have to. Excuse me, I know it's late, but I had to ask this question. It's one of the weird ones, I'm sorry. Is there anyone seriously bringing up the subject of consent in terms of those people? I mean, because, when we have the bones from 1.5 million years ago from Africa, I mean, it's far away, but these are people who had, names and families and may have relatives that are living today, and you are drilling in their heads, basically, as picking them up from the ground and, making the bones into mush and analyzing their DNA and discovering sometimes maybe problematic genetic facts about their lives and their families. Is there anyone actually bringing this up?
Yes, many people. There are a lot of debates on the topic.
Okay.
And much of that debate is related to situations outside of Europe, where like who has the right to investigate, like what questions can be asked, and like the descent of the communities that kind of were living in those areas. That's a huge topic. But you might kind of consider this also for the kind of the samples and that I presented. And here, one thing I think is kind of important. So we are speaking about populations that lived so many generations ago. So if they left any relative, then we are all related to them, or none of us are. So this is such, space in time where, and a lot of gene flow within Europe, etc. So as a decent population that has kind of the right of descent, like we all are that. Yeah. So in that sense, it's a little bit simple when you are studying kind of the older as you go, but kind of a ethical rights and cultural right for those on those samples is actually much more complicated. Like, of course, there are like heritage laws that need to be covered, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. There are two places where the situation is clear. One is America, and one is Australia. So all the archaeological remains, which are older than 15th century, belong to Native Americans. And the living Native Americans, they know these are their descendants. So they feel the right of like consent, giving consent or not for any analysis. And in US especially, this is like the issue which is tackled, this ethical issue. There is a protocol. The same goes with Australia because, the same reason. In all the other countries, it's not so clear, like who is the descendants, who should give this consent. So for this reason, we like recently assume that this is the modern time country borders. So if it's within the borders of this country, it means the country should give us, the government should give us the permit to do it. And we would never be able to do the analysis, any type of analysis, without the consent of the government. So each time I export any bones, including human remains, for example, from Uzbekistan, I need to have a consent from the government, so the license to export them for certain analysis. So this is one, but it doesn't like exclude the huge question, which is a huge issue, which is behind it, that all these modern time laboratories are in Europe and US. And they, and we dig in countries where they don't have their own laboratories usually. So like from this point of view, we also need to like think not to go into this, colonial way of thinking, like, okay, we are digging and also like publishing in big page, papers, but we just don't include these people there. So for this reason, we need to also be very like delicate and always think of including these local researchers into our research, to have local partners, to have their consent, but also their, like meritorical, let's say, input into the paper. So this is crucial. So we don't exclude them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. This was the last of today's events. So thank you very much again, Professor Zuzana Hofmanova, Professor Małgorzata Kot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I wish you all a very lovely evening. And tomorrow is the cosmos, the day of the cosmos, the mysteries of the universe. So we go on with exploring the world's mysteries. Thank you very much and goodbye.